Chapter 1 Concerning Theocracy. Pharaonic theocracy is neither an institution worked out along logical lines nor a government imposed by a religious organization. It is difficult for our mentality to understand how and why royal power and religious guidance can be unified. The state and the government of the country are the essential concern of the administration, with its hierarchy of power representatives. Justice, economics, and military power are apparently incompatible with religion, whose aim is to govern personal conduct in life and the salvation of souls. They are the terms by which we understand the organization of civilized society. It is true that in the light of 19th century science, it is possible to eliminate the existence of a religious body as quite unnecessary to those who are social beings, namely those who possess the herd instinct. From that point of view, man is but a living phenomenon, without country or continuity, a physico-chemical accident. Accordingly, the problem posed by a theocratic order obviously does not exist. There is no God, there are only material needs that can be catered to through technocracy. Here it suffices that the individuals submit to the life conditions laid down by the herd and follow its directives. This submission can continue for a time, but it cannot continue forever. The history of humanity has known similar crises several times before, but man, even when dazed by dialectic sophistry, is not a machine without a soul, and this soul which animates physical man necessarily transcends the corporate. Pharaonic theocracy is exceptional, a governmental and social order unique in all of Western history. Did a similar order exist during the great Celtic epic of the Druids? The lack of documents does not permit us to confirm so. Assyria and Babylonia, on the other hand, never knew true theocracy, which is the domination of the entire life of a people by spiritual truths. We translate theological directive by the word religion, but the meaning attached to this term nowadays is incompatible with the mentality of Pharaonic times. According to the evidence inscribed during a period of over 4,000 years, ancient Egypt did not have a religion as such. It was religion in its entirety, in the broadest and purest acceptation of the term. We cannot understand this. Egyptologists have searched in vain to discover by what means a great people, visibly highly civilized, rich in the arts, powerful in organization, could have been led to accept such a unification of temporal and spiritual powers, always returning to this order despite grave crises and periodic interruptions in the long duration of the empire of the two crowns. In the conclusion of his convincing thesis on the religious character of Pharaonic royalty, Alexander Moray admits his failure to understand how this conception of the king's divinity could have gained prominence. Egypt knew an original concept of religious royalty. The pharaoh is distinguished from the other priest kings in that he is connected to the gods by birth as much as by sacerdotal dignity. He is God because he is priest, but he is only priest inasmuch as he is the son of the gods. This concept of a royalty at once divine and sacerdotal existed from the first known times of Egypt's history. The political regime that stemmed from it endured for 40 centuries and showed itself to be the most permanent element of the entire Egyptian civilization, the most immune to revolutions. The transitory ascension of the priesthood to royalty did bring change to the reciprocal relationships between the king and the gods. The humble mortal priest of Ammon, promoted to king by a stroke of fortune, became subordinated to divine majesty. But if the person of the king occasionally underwent a diminution of authority during the course of several centuries, the principle of divine and priestly royalty survived until the Roman period and disappeared only with Egyptian religion itself under the influence of Christianity. New ideas concerning the character of the royal personage were doubtless introduced into Egypt with the Ptolemies and the Caesars. In the sovereign entourage, a cult of the king was celebrated, which was more in conformance with Hellenic civilization. But the Egyptian temples never knew and never acknowledged these modifications. Whether the king was Greek or Roman, whether or not he also claimed divine descent from his country's gods, this was of no importance. In the temples, where the foreign king was less and less frequently mentioned by name, the son of Isis or the pharaoh continued to celebrate and to receive the unchanging Osirian rituals of ancient times. One keeps wondering what elements were used by theologians of Heliopolis to form the royal doctrine, and how they progressively instilled into the minds of the people a belief that maintained a hold on Egypt for 40 centuries. One element is missing from all the speculations attempting to clarify this enigma: the bond, the binder that joined the cause to effect. as in the problem of magic raised by Dr. Francois Lexa. But the effect, true theocracy, exists. Hence the cause, the theology of the temple, necessarily commands a mean term as demanded by the law of causality. As we shall see, this means term indeed constitutes the entire thesis. It comprehends cause and effect as a single entity. Sacred science, the preeminently sacerdotal science, which since the beginning of the empire was the science of thought, master of divine words and sacred writings. This science, written on papyrus scrolls, included the myth as well as the religious rituals, medicine, geometry, astronomy, and the laws of everyday life and of justice. These sacred books were kept in the sanctuaries of the Egyptian temples and were accessible only to the highest religious and royal authorities. Yet it was quite natural for any scribe to call himself a servant of Thoth, the patron of writing. The Greeks, therefore, in their contact with the declining Egypt, were prompted to speak of science in general as belonging to Thoth or Hermes. The meaning of sacred science was thus vulgarized under the term Hermeticism. In truth, the purpose of the modest offering is to convey a succinct understanding of the important reality of sacred science, which is not to be confused with the vernacular meaning conveyed by Hermeticism. This undertaking demands a look at the history of thought in the West and at history of man in the light of that thought. What is the general attitude in our day-to-day toward this Hermetic science usually referred to as alchemy? The word is of Islamic origin and signifies the science of al-Kemet, encountered by the Arab invaders of Egypt. This ancient Kemet, which gave so much light to an Islam setting out to conquer the world. For nearly everyone, alchemy is the science of making gold and nothing more. For some, it is a fantasy. For others, a mysterious science of fascinating discovery. There are also the spiritually minded who consider alchemy to be a psycho-spiritual science of transforming consciousness and the acquisition of psychic, if not spiritual, powers. Today, by means of violence perpetrated on the atom, nuclear science has managed to demonstrate the possibility of the transmutation of bodies previously considered to be simple and unalterable. It is claimed, therefore, that the dream of the old alchemists has been realized at last. The fact of transmutation as demonstrated by contemporary science completely alters the conception of matter accepted in the 19th century, and every concept of evolution basic to materialistic science is thereby unsettled. These transmutations achieved by brute force have nothing in common, however, with what the Hermetic tradition understood transmutation to be. And yet there is something of sacred science that continues to radiate through a vulgarized alchemy. This aspect, however, has remained occulted. The erroneous conception of transmutation given by our rationalistic and materialistic science causes the latter to be not only inhuman in its consequences, but evil as well, in that it diverts us from the true endeavor. The science of Thoth is the sacerdotal science of all times, because it is founded on an irrational basis and would be totally absurd otherwise. Its foundations are identical to those of every other philosophy concerned with the beginning of things. No determinate body can serve as point of departure for the alchemical opus, because what is involved is not a decomposition of matter, notwithstanding the beliefs of our atomists, but a generation of the matter of the world in the image of creation. Thus we are concerned here with revealed knowledge and not with the rational science. Few are they who have been able to penetrate this secret of the beginning. As a spiritual commitment, those who have succeeded have left a token of the existence of this science, by means of riddles or allegories, and especially through theological reflections. They have described the process of work and the phases of becoming, yet without revealing the essential secret. With Hermetic texts as a basis, Western writings as well as those of the ancient sages, it is possible to reach a fairly clear idea of the Hermetic process in order to compare this to sacred teachings, in particular to those of the Pharaonic temple. Despite the obvious concordance, however, it could still be asked whether these Hermetic texts, with gold as their bait, did not simply transmit theological teachings in a seductive manner. This doubt has been removed since nuclear science demonstrated the instability of simple elements, thus annulling the absolutist argument with chemistry in principle opposed to the possibility of transmutation. It is evident that the transmutation proved by science has no relationship to theological principles, but the fact remains certain today for everyone that there is a common energetic origin to all bodies, and this brings us close to metaphysical assertions about the beginning of things. The possibility of transmutation through a path of Genesis is confirmed by a number of writings, from Pharaonic Egypt as well as from the transition time of Greco-Roman Egypt, and even from fairly recent times in Europe. In according In accordance with all theologies, all these texts are founded on the certainty that it is the divine word, the Holy Spirit, which alone is able to animate matter, and that therein lies the secret of origin. The separation between these two concepts reflects the divorce of two irreconcilable mentalities. One of these concepts points to a kinetic energy, immanent in matter as a starting point for the variety of types. The other calls upon an undefined cosmic energy. With absurd reasoning, our science sees in the universe nothing but a closed circuit, an agglomerate, and a decomposition of the selfsame matter. Such a view is certainly less reasonable than the admission of an undefined source of energy, which becomes matter, although the latter solution poses a purely metaphysical problem. From there, it is but a small step to seeing a divine principle in the harmony of the world. It is certain that the ordinary mind does not view things in this way and dreams only of making gold in order to become rich, without realizing that if a simple secret of manufacture were involved, gold would in any case cease to be of value. Paradoxically, therefore, it is rationalistic science which justifies the possible existence of a sacred science based on an origin irrational in itself. Thus there exists proof of what is affirmed by sacerdotal science, and it demonstrates the genesis of the great work of the universe. Hence, there is a parallelism between the teaching of the phases of becoming of a perfect substance, spiritual in its origin and in its finality, and sacred teachings, whatever they may be. Sacred science is like a grid, a colored background upon which all moments of the pharaonic teachings can be inscribed. On one of the end possibilities, the transmutation of elements proves that the beginning announced by the text must be true. The thing in itself is then of small importance, since its entire history can be read and situated. Thus, the entire passion of Osiris and the more profound passion of Christ can be lived in oneself. Passion must be considered here not as suffering, but as the joy of being able to envision resurrection beyond humankind. This principle pertains to every being who decides to pursue the true path. To generate the opus magnum is to generate within us the liberation from our suffering and mortal condition, and inversely to search for this liberation is also to realize the opus magnum. The possibility of making gold has always been used by sages to hoodwink fools, so that the children of wisdom, who cannot be deceived by selfish satisfactions, may be led toward the true path, which is the search for the real vision of the universe. Without the promise of gold, would the texts of Master Hermeticists have been disseminated, safeguarded, and respected by the ignorant? We can now conclude that the foundation stone of wisdom is unspecified and belongs to none of the three kingdoms, yet its nature is to animate all. It is spiritual and may also, of course, be directed or oriented toward mineral, toward plant, and toward animal. As it is medicine for the human body, so it is medicine for the metal. It eliminates all impurity, leaving only the purity of perfect equilibrium. Did the Lord Christ not cure leprosy? The formula life, health, strength, which is always joined to the Pharaoh's name, is translated as a wish addressed to him when it is he, the true King of Kings, who dispenses life, health, and strength. Following the path charted by sacred science, this is how the world appears. This is generation, that is, the development of matter as a fetal becoming. There is fixation into the corporeality of cosmic energy. There is an irrational source as the origin of things. There is a resurrection of spiritualized corporeality and a return toward the source, as a corporeal matter is but a transitory and relative aspect of an activity and reactivity of two natures sundered and issued from a cosmic oneness. This final matter is the only true king. Theology and science, then, reside in one single expression. Therefore, there exists a completely different relation of man toward the universe, and hence the possibility of a civilization such as is found in pharaonic Egypt, in ancient India, and in ancient China. Accordingly, there are many revisions to be brought to our judgments regarding ancient people of whom only traces remain, such as the Maya and the Inca. Instead of concerning itself with the decomposition of matter in order to find energy, instead of attempting to explain everything through the analysis of matter, its decomposition, its aging, its radioactivity, instead of pursuing this false track, the legitimate concern of science should be the search for the true source of matter. That source epitomized by this word, which says it all, God, and in that light to study the becoming of forms that inhabit the universe. To some, these statements will seem no more than a relapse, a regression to old beliefs, to superstition, and to puerile stance, devoid of scientific spirit, of a time happily transcended. To this I reply, we are concerned with a proved reality and not a belief. I mean to say that it is a veritable elite which forms the temple, a radiating temple and not a temple that imposes an exclusive dogma, restraining and contracting any impulse of expansion of thought or of the arts, a temple basing its theological teaching on proofs given by scientific demonstration. This demands the two paths of possible survival, which lead quite naturally to theocracy, the myth being but a support to the people and a guide for the man wanting and able to elevate himself. I earnestly anticipate the time when an enlightened being will be able to bring the world proof of the mystery of the beginning. There is much talk of the new age, Aquarius. This time is in preparation, but not yet come. With it will come this prophet who will establish a new world. Then there will no longer remain any doubt concerning the Pharaonic teachings, or about the words of the Gospels, or the promises of authentic sacred texts. It is said that Christianity, universal in character, is the last teaching brought to men, and the word of an epic's ending. It is true that there is no higher teaching, but there is the constant beginning anew. One must always begin again, and it is due to this constant renewal that those who have not sinned against the Holy Spirit, meaning those who have not definitely repudiated the Spirit which makes and animates all, may come and go in order to discover the light at last. The predominant idea developed in the Pharaonic Book of the Dead is expressed by its title, Book of Coming Forth by Day. These teachings promise the pure that the soul will be allowed to go and to come, that is, to return to the terrestrial world. The impure, on the other hand, the rejected ones, those who have sinned against the Holy Spirit, will know the second death, the definite death, the eclipse of the sun described in the Book of Quirins, the Book of Caverns, the most dreaded of punishments. More than 3,000 years separate us from the flourishing epoch of the 18th Pharaonic dynasty, that of Amenhotep. The Tutmosids of Hatshepsut, the Armenian experiment, and the restoration of the occult of Amun, with Tutankhamun stepping back in time, is less impressive for us than comparing today's progress with the state of things a mere 50 years ago. Here we can compare, there we cannot. Inspired by a natural egotism, our complacency permits us to go back not only 3,000 years into humanity's history, but with paleoanthropology to turn the clock easily back 25,000 or 50,000 years in order to join the presumed moment when an anthropoid opened the path toward a Homo sapiens, capable of coordinating his thoughts. 50,000 years, a conservative estimate as far as I am concerned, have no significance for us. As the history of the origin and becoming of thinking man, this backward movement in time constitutes from the anthropologists only a stripping, a sort of unclothing of the faculties, qualities, and powers we have obtained over a hostile nature. On the testimony of a few bones and some rock drawings and figurations found in caves, we undress morally and intellectually to the point of being no more than cavemen. As long as the operation is purely subtractive, everything is easy, since one and for all we accept that at a certain moment, all that could have happened was that an animal phylum developed toward a thinking human in order to end with our present superiority. For our science, the difficulty starts with the possible motivations for the various gestures and conditions making for the successive acquisitions, such as upright posture, or the change from a hairy animal into a naked man in need of animal furs to clothe himself. To such a concept of paleontology, one can compare the wisdom tradition that speaks of the genesis of man in general through races and sub-races. In conformity with man's fetal evolution, the faculties awaken successively just as the organs are formed in the embryo. In that case, there exists a genetic vision of becoming, a genesis like the genesis or growth of any other seed. At the origin, there is this human seed, just as there is a seed for any living thing. This concept is, of course, excluded from a rational science, which denies the mysterious and metaphysical moment, as its reasoning must link everything in a logical and mechanical manner. An attempt is now being made to combine paleontology with genetics in order to construct a justifiable science of evolution, made in the name of the phenomenon of mutations. This attempt finds its weakness precisely in the fact that the causes of mutations are unknown. We are dealing here with a confirmed phenomenon. Its causes, however, remain mysterious. In fine, subtracting is easy where life is concerned, but to add, in that case, is senseless. The arguments that motivate the multiple conditions demanded by the slightest step on the path from unreasoning animal to thinking man end up taking refuge in statistics and in calculations of probability. Our tendency to judge the past on the basis of a comparison with ourselves A perfectly natural tendency, moreover, conceives duration not as a factor separating an ancient civilization from ours, but rather as an evolutionary succession. Past civilization is held to be inferior to ours since it has preceded us. In fact, neither time nor space separates profoundly. In order to obtain true divorce, there must be a difference of mentality. The state of mind separates or unites. We must search the state of mind for the mainspring of all behavior. This holds true for the phases of man's development, as well as for the history of humanity, which differs from the humanity of today's history. Whatever be the origin of humanity, and we shall return to this problem, we must first of all agree that diverse orientations in its development are possible. Necessarily, these orientations are conditioned first by the physical milieu within which evolution takes place, and next by the intelligent contact of humanity with natural phenomena. This contact can be more specifically cerebral or emotional, but it can also be intuitive, by which I mean consciously instinctive. The three aspects necessarily interplay, but the predominance of one of these contacts determines the different characters: the mental intellectual, the religio mystical, or else the wisdom character. The character is reflected in the mentality of a people, and particularly in the mentality of the leaders of that people. Which mentality is preferable? Today, one would readily opt for the results from mental intellectual contacts, as did the Greeks, and before them, the decadent Babylonians. All things considered, the result, an end susceptible of attainment, acts as a determining factor. These mentalities make for the only true separation between peoples and civilizations. Emotivity certainly predominates among black Africans, and their animism remains vitally incomprehensible to the rational mind. Inversely, no reasoning can convince the devout animist who lives intensely on the physical level and remains in communion with the spirits of the dead, while the rationalists will create a scholarly way of thinking and a mechanistic science. The intuitive is much more rarely encountered than the emotive or the intellectual, but such were the Sumerians as far as we can determine, and to the highest degree the pharaonic caste of ancient Egypt, as their working and writings testify. There is no more perfect divorce from the mentality of natural wisdom which prevailed in ancient Egypt than the one imposed in recent times by Western mentality. The latter is purely cerebral. They are two epics, two humanities that cannot understand one another as long as they persist in judging each other by their respective frames of mind. This distance has not always been so precisely marked, however, and it is only the recent outcome of the Western orientation that shows a strict opposition between the two mentalities. For the Occident to reach this extreme and perfect intellectual definition, it had to be implanted with a seed that grew slowly, and in spite of the apparent opposition of the Roman Catholic Church at a time when the latter tinged our entire civilization with religiosity. But it is precisely the evangelical character revelation that provokes the future development of a rational search. We will understand this better when discussing the nature of myth. Pure and simple faith seeks no proof, but a day came when science counterbalanced this faith. In scholastic times, during those interminable discussions, men dedicated themselves in secret, and on the basis of ancient traditions called hermetic, to the search for a science, that is, for tangible proofs of the truths asserted by the Christic revelation. Most believers were confused by the historic human aspect by means of which these truths were spread, and they failed to understand the cosmic character of the images and parables of the gospel. It was the aim of the few wise men who understood the universal character of this teaching, and in those times it was an obligation as well to formulate eternal truth with Christic images and words, whence the attempt by Joanne Andre to form a Rosicrucian society around the myth of Christian Rosenkreuz. At all events, the rows of sages around the symbol of the cross is a reality for the processional era of Pisces. Jesus Christ's divine incarnation is truth, and the science that so demonstrates is the sacred science of all times, the sacred science and white magic of the temple. In the West, the few enlightened adepts of the Middle Ages were forced to hide. If they wrote, their duty always being to leave some testimony of the truth of their science, they could do so only anonymously, or perhaps under the protection of a personality powerful enough to assuage governmental and ecclesiastical suspicions. Believing themselves sufficiently strong to escape control of those two powers, the Knights Templar were led to the stake by their own audacity when those two villains joined forces against them. But man's curiosity cannot be squelched. A few principles of Hermetic science were circulating at large, and profane spirits with positivistic minds ignorant of metaphysical causes were gradually able to formulate a chemical and physical science. Not having been founded on the abstract realities of philosophy, this science took on a rational form. Thus, the Hermeticists' principle of fire eventually became phlogistic, a fiery principle immanent in certain materials and rendering them combustible. This concept remained in vogue until Lavoisier demonstrated the fact that oxygen sustained combustion, combining as gas, burning, oxidizing the elements, and being susceptible of recovery. Nothing created, nothing lost. With that thunderclap, science heralded the era of atheism, shaking the foundations of faith, henceforth opposed by the facts of reason. The science that is the pride of our times is very recent, but the spirit of dialectic, that infernal temptation concealed in men's nature, dates from the beginnings of so-called thinking humanity. Dialectic is reasoning, and reasoning needs tangible facts. Armed with syllogistic logic, the same logic for which the old scholastics had defined all possible combinations, it finally formulates only mechanistic thinking. In those Middle Ages, believers, after performing their devotions, had only to work and to discuss. Devotions. In them resides the entire Western Middle Ages. God assumed human incarnation in order to suffer all the evil caused by the original sin. All is said, there is nothing further to seek. There is only prayer for the individual soul's salvation. In a definitive sense, each one is personally responsible for his own salvation or damnation. So says the Church. This ostracism, excluding all research, be it even that of a sacred science, will provoke the reaction which I call the science of evil, for it is false. Its only possible consequences are inhuman in effect, it being purely technical and meant only for utilitarian aims exterior to man's intimate life. The final destruction then becomes logical, if only through the absurdity of a life without spiritual aim and the atrophy of the senses, which causes man to lose contact with his work. We are far removed from pharaonic times, when science was a knowledge of causes, when work was the fusion of the artisan with his craft. There has never been a greater distance between consciousnesses than there is our time between Western mentality and the mentality of the ancient Egyptian sages.